Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, you know more than just about anybody else here that across the nation there's been a dramatic increase in the incidence of opioid addiction, which is now at the point of being a full-blown crisis. In my home state of North Carolina, we've seen this devastation firsthand, with 1,358 overdose deaths in 2014 alone, fueled by the combination of abuse of opiate-based prescription painkillers and heroin. To put that figure into context, that's more than the number of North Carolinians who lost their lives in automobile accidents in 2014. For far too long, the conventional thinking was that drug addiction deserved the stigma it receives, a choice made by criminals who were intent on destroying the lives of themselves and others. It was a dark and painful embarrassment for their families, and it's long overdue for us to come to grips with reality, because we know the truth. Drug addiction doesn't discriminate based on one's gender, race, or socioeconomic status. Successful CEOs of major companies have succumbed to addiction. Straight-A students and valedictorians with once bright futures ahead of them have succumbed to addiction. PTA moms and dads who were pillars of their communities have succumbed to addiction. We know it because we've seen it in our inner cities, our suburbs, and our tight-knit rural areas. 2 weeks ago, I picked up a hometown newspaper, the Charlotte Observer. On the front page was a report that highlighted the rising prescription overdose epidemic. It started off with a terrifying story from a North Carolina mother. It encapsulates the kind of crisis we're dealing in. The story began, the Charlotte woman didn't know her daughter was a drug addict until she heard a thud upstairs. Her daughter, a bright Myers Park High School graduate, had returned from college for the weekend with a sack of dirty laundry. Her mother was folding clothes in the den when she heard the fall of her daughter's unconscious body. She sprinted upstairs. She's unconscious on the floor, blue, not breathing, no heartbeat. That's what the mother saw on the floor of her daughter's bedroom. Fortunately, in this case, the young woman survived the painkiller overdose. With the support of a loving family, she has an opportunity to get her life back and on track and seize the chance to reach her full potential. But let's not kid ourselves. This near tragedy could have happened nearly anywhere in America, and any parent could have experienced it. It's important to reflect on how we got to this point, though. In 2012, the CDC completed a report that said in North Carolina, there were 97 painkiller prescriptions written per 100 people. So what does that mean? It doesn't mean that 97% of the people in North Carolina are getting painkillers. It means that there's a group of people who are getting dozens and dozens, sometimes hundreds of prescriptions of opioids. In part, this is a result of a greater awareness of the importance of pain management. And many people do need pain medication. But the wider availability of these life-improving and life-saving surgeries and treatments have actually contributed to the epidemic. The medical community rightly recognized that managing patient pain was the compassionate thing to do and started holding providers accountable for doing so. However, the risk of the wider availability of these powerful medicines must be urgently and rigorously addressed. That is because for Americans from all walks of life, the nightmare of addiction begins with something as unassuming as a routine prescription for a painkiller, like Oxycontin or Percocet. Due to the highly addictive nature of these drugs, a patient's body can become dependent and they experience debilitating withdrawal. Once the prescription runs out, the physical addiction, unfortunately, influences people to make really bad decisions that can be life-changing. Seeking more pills on the black market when their doctor says no more, or turning to cheaper or even more deadly opioid drugs like heroin. Opioid addiction is a slippery slope, and it's a deadly slope. The CDC has concluded that people are 40 times more likely to be addicted to heroin if they are addicted to prescription painkillers. Our country desperately needs coordination from federal, state, local law enforcement officials to develop comprehensive strategies to combat heroin trafficking and to prevent prescription drug diversion. Federal dollars and resources come with so much red tape, though, and mandates that state and local experts cannot use funding for different initiatives, and that's what the CARE bill seeks to address. For example, there simply aren't enough treatment slots for mothers with children, and there isn't enough assistance provided to pharmacists and doctors to teach them how to best manage their prescriptions and help the people with the highest risk of addiction. It has been heartening to see members of Congress set aside their partisan differences in order to take immediate action to address the current shortcomings. I'm proud to be a co-sponsor of the Comprehensive Addiction and Recovery Act, which is the bipartisan legislation that brings together the experiences and recommendations of drug addiction experts, law enforcement, healthcare providers, first responders, and the patient community most affected by the opioid epidemic. The legislation expands abuse prevention and education initiatives. It provides grants to substance abuse agencies, local governments, and nonprofit organizations in North Carolina and the rest of the nation that are being hit hardest by the heroin and painkiller epidemic. Local first responders receive help through expanded availability of naloxone. Now, naloxone is a powerful antidote that is used to prevent overdose deaths. It has had amazing impacts on saving the lives of people like the young lady I talked about earlier. The legislation also addresses the strain the addiction crisis places on our criminal justice system by providing more resources to identify and treat incarcerated Americans, helping put them in the path to recovery, which in turn could lower the nation's recidivism and crime rates. We can never forget that the solution to so many of America's problems can be found in our local communities, our schools, our churches, town halls, and VFW halls. The federal government can help support these efforts through smart, common sense approaches like the Comprehensive Addiction and Recovery Act, or CARA. However, we must be honest in recognizing that success will be neither quick nor easy. We're confronted with the reality that addiction is a vicious and devastating cycle of abuse and despair, with consequences that can result in the destruction of loving families and the end of once promising lives. It affects us all, Mr. President. The fight against addiction is one we must wage together, and we cannot afford to lose. And Mr. President, I want to thank you personally for your leadership on this issue. I look forward to seeing the CARE bill come to the Senate and go into the President's desk. Thank you, Mr. President.